by J. Muddock. The Story of a Hanged Man. My name is Phelim Connor. By parentage, I am Irish. But I was born on August 2nd, 1820, at or near a little town called Troy in the state of Pennsylvania, America. My parents, who were highly respectable, kept a store in that place, and being naturalized Americans, and as I passed 30 years of my life in the States, never having been out of the country from the day of my birth until I was a little past 30, I suppose I have a right to call myself an American. On January 8th, 1849, I was put upon my trial for murder. The trial took place at Philadelphia. It lasted 4 days, and although I was very ably defended, a verdict of guilty was returned against me, and I was sentenced to death. For a whole year I languished in prison, for in America there are so many legal quibbles that a prisoner under sentence of death can avail himself of, that he may postpone the carrying out of his sentence for a considerable time, even if he does not succeed in setting it aside altogether. In my case, every artifice that the cunning of the legal mind could suggest was resorted to, but without avail, and at last the warrant for my death arrived. Thereupon the scaffold was erected, and on February 4th, 1850, I was taken from my cell to the exterior of the prison walls, and in the presence of an enormous concourse of spectators, I was duly hanged. I am aware that this is a startling statement, and will be received with incredulity. But read what follows, and I will give you such facts and figures that you will no longer doubt. Moreover, the story I have to tell is so strange and startling, and withal so true, that it would be hard to find a parallel to it. I was tried before the Honorable Aaron Osgood, one of the supreme judges of the criminal courts in the state of Pennsylvania, and the well-known author of American Criminal Law, which is the standard work in America at the present day. He is also the author of the more widely known American State Criminal Trials, which is likewise a standard book of reference. The leading lawyer for the prosecution was Salem Isaac Shimmer, Esquire, public prosecutor for the state, and his juniors were Mark Phelps, now a judge of the New York bench, and Henry Walford Lane, subsequently of the state criminal procedure offices at Washington, but since dead. My defending counsel was the Honorable Washington Cleveland, admitted to be one of the most powerful pleaders in America, and he was assisted by Gifford Jefferson, Esquire, who has since become famous by his great work, American Laws and the Men Who Founded Them. Anyone who is at all acquainted with America will know that the trial in which I was the chief actor must have been of no ordinary kind to have brought together such a galaxy of legal talent as is represented by the names I have mentioned. The incidents that led up to the trial had kept the whole country in a state of excitement for months, and the trial itself was one of the most sensational on record. During those 4 memorable days, the business of the town almost came to a standstill, and all day long, both inside and out of the courthouse, military guards were posted to keep the excited crowds in order. When the verdict became known, so high did partisan feeling run that a riot broke out, and was not suppressed until blood had been shed. There was a very large following indeed in my favor, and considering that I had been unjustly condemned, they allowed their feelings to get the better of their discretion, with the result I have stated. During the 12 months that I lay in prison, my friends were very active, and they left no stone unturned to try and save me from the hangman. But the government declining to interfere, the law was allowed to take its course. On the morning of my execution, notwithstanding that a heavy snowstorm was raging and the cold was intense, something like 20,000 people had assembled to witness the last act of legal vengeance. Troops had been drafted into the town to preserve order, and the police and warders of the jail were strengthened by a large addition to their number. The fellow who acted as executioner was a notorious rascal, whose real name was Silas Brunner, but who was known as Chowder Sam. How he came to be so called, I don't know. I believe he had been condemned to life imprisonment for murder, but had been released on condition of his undertaking to execute criminals when called upon to do so. I shall have more to say about him presently. With these preliminary remarks, I will now tell the story of the strange events that led up to my condemnation and execution. I have already said that my parents were highly respectable people. They were both natives of the county of Cork. My father was employed as a clerk in a Cork bank, and my mother was the daughter of a farmer at Inishannon, a little village about 10 miles to the south of Cork City. She was remarkable for her beauty, being of the true Southern Irish type, which, as is well known, approximates to the classical Spanish type. She had a mass of blue-black hair, eyes of sloes, and a pink coral complexion, with a figure that left nothing to be desired. My father was a good-looking, well-proportioned man, and the two met through my mother visiting at the house of some friends in Cork. It was a case of love almost at first sight, and in spite of much opposition on the part of her relatives, she married my father 6 months later. A year after that, a girl was born and died. Then my parents emigrated to America, and after some little wandering about, they finally settled down at Troy, where I was born. I had 2 sisters of whom I shall speak by and by. One of these sisters was destined to play a prominent part in the great tragedy in which I was the leading actor. My parents, having succeeded to a little money through the death of a near relative, opened a general store in Troy, and did so well that they were enabled to give their children a good education. I was intended for a doctor, and having spent some years at school, I was sent to Boston to study for the medical profession. And now let me refer again to my sisters. The eldest, Mary, was as sweet and gentle as a creature as ever the good God put life into. She had all her mother's beauty, with something of it heightened. She could shake her hair out until it touched the ground, and enveloped her like a veil. She had a magnificent head, delicately poised on a swan-like neck. I do not mean to say that she had actually a neck like a swan, but the expression as a figure of speech suggests its perfectness. She had dark, languid eyes with long silken lashes, and a complexion that one could scarcely overpraise. Allied to this physical beauty was a sweet, trusting nature that won every person with whom she came in contact. Well and accurately indeed might I describe my dear sister in the words of the poet: dark her hair as the winter night, white her neck as the alpine snow, red her cheek as the morning light, bright her glance as the artless roe. My second sister, Nora, took more after my father. She hadn't the same wealth of hair, nor the same brilliancy of complexion as Mary. But had Mary not overshadowed her so, Nora would have been pronounced an exceedingly pretty girl. Nor was she quite so gentle and patient as her sister, but she was a dear little woman, quick, impulsive, warm-hearted, generous to a fault, somewhat self-willed, but withal very lovable, and I doted on them both. We were a very united family, and at one time a happier one could not have been found in the United States. These 2 girls were well brought up for people in our station of life, and they were fitted and qualified to take a good position in the world. Between Mary and me, there was a difference in age of 5 years, and between Mary and Nora, 2 years, so that I was 7 years Nora's senior. When I went to Boston to pursue my studies, I was a man. I had been what is usually termed a little wild. But whatever follies could be laid to my charge, they were the follies of boyhood only. I went to Boston full of noble resolve and high purpose. I talked of distinguishing myself and of writing my name on the annals of fame. My intentions were good. They were the outcome of youthful enthusiasm, and my aspirations were ennobling. There was one weakness, however, in my composition. I lacked that one essential to steady progress: dogged perseverance. I was somewhat of a romantic turn of mind, and could not reconcile myself to anything that partook of a humdrum existence. I had, in fact, an excitable and enthusiastic temperament. That temperament that enables soldiers, sailors, explorers, and pioneers in all works of adventure to distinguish themselves in trying moments and perform great deeds. I had a passion for books of travel and adventure. The wonder is, therefore, that I was content to remain stationary as long as I did. But our destinies work themselves out with clockwork regularity and mathematical precision, although sometimes it is difficult to believe that that is the case. Though any man who will carefully examine the details of his life will be surprised to find that each act, no matter how trivial, and each deed has been but a link fitting into a perfect chain, and that no link could be taken away without destroying the harmony of the whole. This is a truism that may astonish many, but its soundness cannot be gainsaid. Notwithstanding the restlessness that always seemed working within me, I spent over 3 years in Boston and made good progress with my studies. In fact, I may state that I was succeeded to some extent in distinguishing myself, for I was possessed of an individuality that would not allow me to be content to remain a mere mechanical nonentity, a human sheep, as it were, that based with the flock. That was a position that would not have satisfied my longings or my restlessness. I made many acquaintances and numerous friends in Boston, but there was only one with whom I became really intimate. The one was Defrid Zadwaski. By nationality he was a Pole, but he had been in the States the greater part of his life. He occupied the important position of professor of languages in the college. In age, he was only a few years older than I was. His disposition and temperament approximated pretty closely to my own in one or two respects. He was restless, for instance, and always seemed to be yearning to constantly change the surroundings of his life. He was ambitious and capable of enthusiasm, but there the parallel ceases. In other respects, he was my antithesis. He was a dreamer for the most part. He was a mystic. His philosophy was tinged with skepticism and morbidness, and he held extraordinary views with regard to the relations of the sexes one to the other. He argued that woman, neither as an actual fact nor as a potentiality, was nor could she become man's equal. That being his inferior both mentally and physically, she was, theoretically at least, man's servant, and that it was her duty to administer to his wants, his pleasures, to afford him gratification, and to anticipate his wishes. That when she ceased to do any of these things, she could and should be put away, as any other hired servant might. Now, although this peculiar doctrine was to me heresy as compared with my own way of thought on the subject, I conceived an unaccountable liking for the man. That he was clever goes without saying, for only a clever man is capable of such distinct individuality as he displayed. But it was not exactly in his cleverness, and certainly not in his physical attributes, that his attractiveness lay, for he was somewhat under the medium height, with a sallow complexion and a rather shrunken figure. It was in a peculiar fascination of manner. Of course, it will be argued from this that only weaker-minded men could fall under his sway, and that consequently I was weak-minded. I'm not prepared to admit that that is altogether correct, but it is no part of my purpose to enter into any critical argument on the subject here. Defrid Zadwaski fascinated me as he fascinated hundreds of others. Moreover, the liking seemed to be mutual. He averred that I charmed him, and that there was an originality about me that he liked. The result was we became close companions. It was not until about the year after we had become really intimate that I took him down one vacation to my home. It may seem singular, and I will confess that it was singular, that I, the brother of two young women who were conspicuous for their beauty and no less for their loving and confiding dispositions, should have brought them under the influence of a man who held such remarkable views as to woman's position. But how often do we do things in life which do not strike us as being outre until after, perhaps long after, they are done? He spent a fortnight at our house on that occasion, and before returning to Boston I asked my sisters what they thought of Zadwaski. Nora answered impulsively, "I don't like him," but Mary, more guardedly, and with an obvious reserve, said, "He's a little peculiar, but still, he's not objectionable." "Did he tell you," I said laughingly, "that his idea of woman is that she should be an absolute slave to man?" "No," she answered quickly, and changing color. This change of color being due to indignation, for Mary had a high opinion of her sex, and her idea was that woman was man's equal in every respect. "Oh, well, you know, Mary," I returned, "men in their youth often say things that are not worth serious consideration. Zadwaski is not a bad fellow, and he is clever." "Yes," she answered, in a strangely thoughtful manner, "he is clever." 6 months later, I took Zadwaski down home again, and that time he was 3 weeks with us. We were, as it seemed, perhaps literally so, a happy party, though the most perfect happiness is at times only but a thin veneer, as it were, that hides unending sorrow. Nature oft-time weaves the beauty and the deadly, the attractive and the revolting together. In the most beautiful of tropical forests, where the eye is ravished by grandeur and sublimity, the deadly serpent lurks, and life and death go linked together. When Zadwaski and I were on our way back, I observed that he seemed much more contemplative than usual. He was frequently given to fits of abstraction, but somehow, now, he appeared to be altogether unusually absorbed. "What is sinking into your ponderous brain now, Defrid?" I asked with a laugh. He started like one who starts suddenly from a dozing condition on being shaken, and he answered me ambiguously, apparently, though his answer was the keynote to the solution of his mood. "I've been thinking that my views in regard to woman require modifying." "Oh!" I exclaimed in surprise. "Yes. Since when did you begin to change your doctrine?" "Since I met your sister Mary." "Indeed," I answered, a little seriously, as a new light dawned upon me. "Am I to understand from that, my friend, that you've fallen in love with Mary?" He did not answer my question immediately. He pondered upon it before he spoke. "You may understand this much. Mary has exercised an influence over me such as no other woman has ever done before." He paused again before asking this question as a correlative to his remark. "Are you glad or sorry to hear that?" "I cannot say at the present moment, but I am either the one or the other," I replied. Perhaps I ought to have guessed that something of this kind was all but inevitable if you and my sister became acquainted. That may be a compliment for you both. But my happiness is so bound up in the happiness of my sisters that I should like to be sure, very sure, that before giving my approval of any engagements, the men who sought them for wives were beyond all question of doubt calculated to enhance their happiness, to respect them as wives, to honor them as women. I saw by the expression of his face that my remark displeased him. There was a point in it, as I intended there should be, and it pricked him a little. He thought, no doubt, that it implied doubt of him. "Well, let us drop the subject for the present," he said, and so we did not discuss it again. For many days after that, however, I was troubled about this matter, and at length I wrote a long letter to Mary asking her to tell me candidly what her feelings were for Zadwaski. Her answer was brief and displeased me. This was about the substance of it. You ask me a question that at present I am unable to answer. I am not even sure of my own feelings, and moreover, dear brother, I am not disposed to make you my confessor, at all events until there is something more definite to confess. Mary, in writing, thus could have had no possible intention of paining me, but she did pain me nevertheless. Some days later, Zadwaski approached me and said, "Pray, my dear fellow, do not attach any importance to what I said the other day. I was under the impression then that I had a growing love for your sister. I have examined my heart since and find I am mistaken. I shall always regard her with great respect, but I shall carefully avoid seeing her again." I confess to a feeling of some relief as he told me this, for much as I had been charmed with the man, when it came to the possibility of his marrying my sister, I viewed him in a different light. After this, we resumed our old relations, and Mary's name was never mentioned. But I was struck by one thing. Zadwaski seemed to change. He went about like a man who had something preying on his mind, and I was under the impression he shunned me somewhat. The result was there was a gradual and almost imperceptible breaking off of that close intimacy that had existed until at last, without any rupture of any kind or any explanation, we seemed by mutual consent to avoid each other. A few months after this change had come about, it chanced that I was standing in the hall of the college when the morning mail was delivered. I was very anxious to receive letters, as I had had none from home for several days, and the last one had spoken of my mother being slightly indisposed. I therefore eagerly examined the bundle of letters, to see what there was for me, and in doing so I came across one addressed to Zadwaski, and the handwriting was that of my sister Mary. My heart leapt into my mouth, for this letter pointed to a secret correspondence, and my distrust of the Pole had become a very real thing now. I said nothing to Zadwaski. I knew too much of him to suppose that he would give me any information. But as soon as I could get away, I went down home and told Mary what my suspicions were. At first, she prevaricated, but at last admitted that she had been carrying on a correspondence. I was hurt and distressed, for I saw that the fascination this man had exercised over her must indeed have been great when it could lead her to deceive or even to attempt to deceive her only brother. I went back to Boston full of determination and feeling as if a crisis in my fate had arrived. I sought an interview with Zadwaski and accused him of treachery and deceit. He refused to plead guilty to the accusation and said he should resolutely decline to consult me as to the course he should pursue in regard to my sister. This defiance and impudence irritated me beyond control, and forgetting myself, I struck him a severe blow. He did not attempt to return it, but he at once brought my conduct under the notice of the authorities, and I was called upon to make a public apology. This I declined to do, and I was told that expulsion would follow if I did not. But I did not wait for them to expel me. I went that very night, and smarting from a sense of unmerited injury and of a wrong done me by my sister, whom I had worshipped, I turned my face westward to those lonely regions where danger and excitement might make a man forget almost that he had lived before. For over 2 years I wandered about those western wilds, and threw myself heart and soul into the adventurous existence peculiar to them. I might fill a big volume with all I went through during that period. I literally carried my life in my hands, but the very excitement begotten by this sort of thing pleased me, and I became oblivious to almost everything else. Then one day, an old newspaper came into my hands, and amongst the obituary notices I read of the death of my mother. If an Indian's arrow had suddenly quivered through my body, I could not have experienced a keener pang or a more sickening sense of faintness than I did when I read that announcement. Oh, how I reproached myself for my long silence and for the way I had left my home. Homesickness came strong upon me at that moment, and I hurried to my native place to find what? Not the peaceful, happy home I had left, but a desolation, a wreck. my father prematurely aged and well nigh distracted, my mother dead, and my sisters gone. "Where are Nora and Mary?" I asked of my father in a choking voice, and feeling as if my heart was literally swelling up and going to burst. I knew something dreadful had happened. It was written in his face, which was wrinkled and haggard. His eyes were sunken, his hair white. My question caused some color to come into his pale cheeks and fire into his dimmed eyes. "I don't know," he said as he ground his teeth and clenched his hands. "I don't know," he repeated with greater emphasis and speaking like a man who was swayed by some mighty passion which he only kept in check by a still mightier effort. I looked at him. His eyes met mine, and in his gaze I read much. Then, before I could recover myself and speak, he broke into sobs and with a reproach in his tone exclaimed, "Oh, Phelim, why did you leave us as you did? Ours was a happy home before you went away. Now look at it. Your dear mother lies in her grave, and your sisters—" That look of passion came back into his face, and his eyes blazed. "I feel inclined sometimes to curse them," he added, hissing the words out, as it were, fiercely. "Hush," I said, "curse not, but tell me all." "Mary went first," he began, but as he spoke, something came up in his throat and seemed to choke him. He made an effort to control himself, then added, "And Nora followed her." The terrible truth flashed upon me now like an inspiration, and I said with unnatural calmness, "And Defrid Zadwoski is responsible for Mary's going away?" "How do you know?" asked my father passionately. "I guess it," I returned. "Yes, he took her away." As my father said this, he was a study of concentrated and yet controlled passion. But had Zadwoski stood there at that moment, would have been his last. It was terrible to see my father now, gentle, generous, and confiding as he had always been, so utterly changed, to see the fierce passion that was shaking him and the craving for revenge that blazed forth from his eyes. But the tigress, robbed of her young, is doubly dangerous, and had not my father been robbed of his daughters, upon whom he had doted? When he grew calmer, he told me the whole pitiable story. After I went away, Zadwoski renewed his visits to our house until my father took a strong dislike to him and forbade him to come again. He returned no more, but kept up a secret correspondence with Mary, who suddenly left her home. The shock of her going away in this manner was awful. It shattered my mother's health and almost deprived my father of reason. But notwithstanding that, Nora disappeared soon after. This last blow crushed my mother into her grave and turned my father into a lonely, broken-hearted old man, whose one prayer, one thought, one hope was revenge. I listened to this terrible story without sign, without motion, without any outward expression of the passion that was almost tearing me into pieces. But that strange calm which precedes the bursting of the tropical typhoon is not more surely indicative of the coming storm than was that unnatural calm which possessed me as my honored father told me of my sister's shame and of Zadwoski's perfidy. At such a time as this, a man, or at any rate, most men, and I was one of them, looks not beyond his human sphere, nor turns his eyes to that mystical hereafter, when, as we are taught, man's wickedness to man shall be divinely judged and divinely punished. He who has no craving for revenge in such an hour of humiliation and shame must have something of the divine element in him. Judged by this, then, I had no such element in me, for in my brain there seemed to ring a voice that cried ceaselessly, "Revenge! Revenge!" On the table in the room in which my father had told me the story of shame was the large, old family Bible, from which my beloved mother was in the habit of daily reading to us when we were children. I placed my right hand on the sacred book, and standing erect I raised my left arm at full length, with the index finger pointing to heaven, and still, outwardly calm, and with wonderful self-possession, I spoke, and this is what I said. I can repeat the sentence word for word with unerring accuracy, for every word burned itself into my brain. Father, here in your presence, with my hand on this Bible and in the sight of heaven, I swear to search the earth, if necessary, to find Defrid Zadwoski, and, when I have found him, to kill him. A cry of fierce joy broke from my father's trembling lips, and tottering to me, he threw his arms round my neck and embraced me, saying the while, "Now, indeed, you are my son. While the destroyer of your sister lives, the earth groans from the presence of a foul monster. Slay him, and every honest man in the world to whom honor is more precious than life will bless you." "And now tell me," I said, "know you where Zadwoski is?" "No." "Then from north to south, from east to west will I wander until I have found him," I answered. An hour later I started on my quest, and I went direct to Boston in order to try and get a clue to the man I was now sworn to hunt down and kill. The return to the scenes of my happy college days affected me deeply, as many golden memories were recalled. But my heart softened not, my purpose never wavered. The voice in my brain still rang out, "Revenge! Revenge!" I learned in Boston that the last known of Zadwoski was that he was resident in New York as a teacher of languages. That night I was on my way to New York. I had no difficulty in finding Zadwoski's address, as it was in the directory. I accordingly made my way to 104th Street, at the top of the 5th Avenue and near Central Park. But on arriving there, it was only to find that he whom I sought had gone away 6 months before, without leaving any address. He had occupied rooms in a flat, and the proprietor of this flat was a man. To him I addressed myself, asking many particulars of his erstwhile lodger, and from the landlord's lips I learned the following particulars, which I give in his own words. He had 2 ladies with him when he came here. One he represented as his wife, and the other as his wife's sister. But I found out afterwards that one was just as much his wife as the other. In short, he was not married to either, but he treated them both, poor things, as if they had been his slaves. There is a common expression, "my blood boils," used to convey some indication of unutterable indignation and anger at wrong or insult done to one. It is a figure of speech, of course, but there are times when outrage to one's feelings is so great that it literally seems as if the blood bubbled up in the veins. Such a feeling as this did I experience as I listened to the landlord's words. And yet, outwardly I was calm, but mentally I repeated the oath I had taken in my father's house, and the dumb voice in my brain cried with accentuated emphasis, "Revenge!" But all the story was not yet told. And dreaming not that I was the brother sworn to avenge the wrongs done to his sisters by shedding the blood of the wretch who had destroyed them, the landlord gave me a sequel. The younger of the 2 ladies, Nora she was called, seemed always to be in a state of great despondency, and she suffered greatly from hysterical outbursts. In that state she used to curse Zadwoski and call constantly for Phelim. Who Phelim was or is, I don't know, for the 3 of them were very reticent and never spoke of their connections. "Phelim," I answered quietly, "is the name of Nora's brother, and should he and Zadwoski ever meet, Zadwoski's life will not be worth a minute's purchase." "Ah!" exclaimed the landlord in a gratified way. "He deserves killing, for 2 more charming girls I never knew, and yet he treated them shamefully. Poor Nora got so bad at last that she was removed to the 5th Ward Lunatic Asylum." This statement caused me for the first time to betray my feelings. It was as if he had struck me a violent blow, causing me to stagger. He looked somewhat surprised and asked, "Are you any relation?" "Yes," said I, "her brother Phelim." "Good God!" exclaimed the landlord. "Is it possible?" I was calm again as I answered, Yes, I am her brother, and I have sworn on the Bible to kill Zadwaski." The landlord grasped my hand and wrung it. He was much moved. "The villain deserves it," he said. "But the taking of life, even the life of one who has wronged you, is by the law of our country murder, and the punishment for murder is an ignominious death." I smiled contemptuously, but I know that I had the landlord's sympathy, for he wrung my hand again. Then we parted, and I at once made my way to the Fifth Ward Lunatic Asylum. I was told that Nora Connor, the name she was known by there, was a hopeless lunatic, that her mind was quite shattered. Not without great difficulty did I obtain permission to see her. How can I describe my feelings as I was ushered into her presence and saw before me a haggard, pale old young woman? The eyes vacant and staring, the face puckered with an imbecile grin, the head clean-shaven and covered with a closely fitting skull cap. All day long, I was told, she paced up and down the room to which she was confined, muttering to herself and occasionally crying out, "Phelim, Phelim, Phelim." If ever man's heart bled, as the saying is, mine did. Her mind was such a blank that she utterly failed to recognize me, and as I went away I said to myself, "May heaven trebly curse me if I let Zadwaski live." I ascertained at the asylum that for a short time after Nora had been taken there, a lady, her sister, called occasionally to see her. But these visits ceased, though for a little while a sum of money was sent regularly to enable Nora to be supplied with extra comforts. But the remittances suddenly stopped also. "From what part of the country did the remittances come?" I asked. "From Philadelphia," was the answer. 4 hours later I was on my way to Philadelphia. On arrival there I immediately consulted a directory, but searched in vain for Zadwaski's name. There was an agency, however, for teachers of languages in the town, and thither I went as a sort of forlorn hope. But fate served me, and I found that the agency had the villain's name on their books. He was staying in Philadelphia, and his address was given to me. At last, then, I had run him to earth, and his hours were numbered. But I did not rush off there and then to slay him. Such impulse would not have accorded with my temperament. I must kill this man slowly and deliberately, so that in his dying moments there should be compressed some of the agony that he had inflicted on me and mine. My first step was to ascertain something of his habits, and if my sister Mary was with him. I soon found out that she was not. She was elsewhere. That elsewhere was an obscure grave, marked only with a number in the cemetery. That number corresponded with a number in the books of the cemetery, and against the number was written, "Mary Connor, native of the United States, date of birth unknown, supposed to be between 25 and 30 years of age at time of death, class of grave H2 in Roman Catholic portion of cemetery." This class of grave, as I was informed, was the very poorest class, and in that part of the cemetery no stones were allowed to be placed over the dead. Here were gathered the waifs and strays, the unknown dead, the suicides and the like, and in this spot lay the remains of my once beautiful sister. To that humble grave I went in the gloaming of the somber October day. In the low, blurred sky was no gleam of light. From the trees the withered leaves were falling, and over those nameless mounds the wind wailed and sobbed. Kneeling down, I renewed my oath, and then, falling across the grave, I wept tears of phosphorus or some other scalding matter, for I had no ordinary tears to shed. And in that supreme moment of agony my heart broke in twain. I arose and turned away. The night had come, even as the night of my life had come. The world was naught to me now. It contained only two persons as far as I was concerned, the one myself, the other Zadwaski, and when I had killed him I should be a lonely man in a lonely world. This man lodged in a respectable house. He occupied 2 rooms, and his habit was to go every evening to a well-known saloon where he sat playing chess, a game of which he was inordinately fond, until a late hour. To that saloon I repaired, and then, for the first time since I last saw him in Boston, I gazed upon his accursed features, and a fierce mad joy filled me. He had altered greatly. There were traces of dissipation on his face, and a restless, pained expression in the eyes that looked like remorse. Was it remorse? Could such a monster, who had wrecked a happy home and destroyed 2 dear women, feel remorse? No, I was wrong. It was not remorse. It was fear. For 3 long hours I sat in a corner and watched him, and I thrilled with a sense of exquisite joy that at last my quest was ended, and that never again would I lose sight of him until his black and rotten heart had ceased to beat. Midnight struck from the town clock, and a few minutes later he rose to go. I rose too. He was in the shadow of death, but he did not know it then. He shook hands with his companions and he laughed, but it was not the laugh of a man who was happy. Then he lit a cigar and went out into the dark night and towards his grave. Rain was falling. A bitter wind was sweeping through the deserted streets, and pulling his coat about his throat and battering his hat down upon his head, he hurried along. And I followed noiselessly, as if my feet had been shod in wool. Up the many flights of steps that led to his lodgings he went, and I was within a few yards of him. He opened the door of his house with a latch key. I had, by a subterfuge, previously provided myself with a key, and 10 minutes after he had entered, I softly opened the door, closing it as softly after me. Then I crept to his room. He had thrown off his coat, wrapped himself in a rug, and was finishing his cigar. As I entered, I turned the key in the door, and the noise caused him to glance round, and seeing a stranger in his apartment, he sprang up and exclaimed, "What is the meaning of this? Who are you?" "I am Phelim Connor," I answered slowly and solemnly. He staggered back, his face turned ashen. The half-burnt cigar fell from his blanched lips, and a look of mortal fear came into his eyes. "What do you want here?" he gasped out hoarsely. "I have come to kill you," I answered. A look of unutterable, absolutely indescribable terror swept over his ghastly face. He cast a nervous glance at the door of his bedroom, but between it and him I stood. No doubt in his room he had some weapon, but he could only reach it over my dead body, and in my hand, which was firm as a rock, I held a revolver. "You wouldn't kill me in cold blood," he whined. I laughed, a mocking laugh of derision. "You wrecked my home in cold blood," I hissed. "You sent my mother to her grave in cold blood. You drove one of my sisters mad in cold blood, and in cold blood you broke the heart of the other and cast her body into a pauper's grave. A man, when he sees a snake crawling at his feet, crushes it in cold blood. To my mind you are infinitely more loathsome and more horrible than the most deadly of reptiles, and I shall slay you in cold blood, as you call it. That is, I shall kill you without the slightest compunction." "God pity me," he moaned. "No," I replied, "God will not pity you. You are accursed, even of heaven." In the madness of his despair, he seized a chair to hurl at me, but, with never a nerve of my body quivering, I fired, purposely striking him in the shoulder, just below the neck. He reeled and fell against the table, and the sight of his blood pouring out filled me with savage delight. "Pity!" he gurgled. "Yes," I returned, "the pity you accorded to my dear sisters." Again I fired, shattering his right arm, and he sank to the floor with a groan. He was not dead, not even insensible. but I had a conviction that his life was fast ebbing away, and so I did not fire again, but kneeling down I put my lips to his ear and hissed, "I curse you, Defrid Zadwoski. Die with all your heavy sins upon your soul." By this time the household was aroused. There were the shrill screams of women, the cries of men who were thundering at the door. I turned the key, and flinging the door open, confronted the clamoring and affrighted people. "There lies a human reptile," I said, "and I have in cold blood, and deliberately out of malice aforethought, killed him. Here is my weapon, and all I ask is that you will let me witness his dying agony." My revolver was taken, and I was seized by men, but I wrenched myself free and stepped back to where Zadwoski was lying. He turned his dying eyes upon me. Then I saw them glaze. I heard a gurgle in his throat, saw his breast flutter, and knew then that he was dead. I confronted the people and said, "My revenge is satisfied as far as it can be on earth, and now you can do as you like with me." There is no purpose to serve in dwelling upon all the details of my arrest, my lodgment in prison, the weary waiting for the trial, and the trial itself to which I have alluded. At first a public cry of rage went up against me. Zadwoski was supposed to have been highly respectable. He was spoken of as a quiet, inoffensive gentleman, and the press said my crime, if crime it was deliberate, brutal, and fiendish. Gradually, however, some of the particulars of the story of shame and wrong began to leak out, and it was found that the saint-like Pole had been a devil in disguise. My friends, and I'm happy to say I had many, took my case up very warmly, and one of the most ardent defenders of my act of vengeance was Dr. Silas King. This gentleman was for some years on the surgical staff of the New York Infirmary, but had been settled in Troy for a long time, and had been our family doctor. He knew my dear sisters intimately, and had once asked Mary to become his wife. He was a widower with 2 children, and as there was considerable disparity of age between him and Mary, my people opposed the marriage, although they much admired Dr. King. He said that if he did not get Mary, he would never marry again, and he kept his word. Now, when he learned the dreadful fate of my sisters, he threw himself heart and soul into my defense. He was an eloquent speaker and a good writer, and he both wrote and spoke in my defense, sparing no time, trouble, or expense. He gave Zadwoski's history to the world and showed what a black-hearted villain he was, and how shamefully he had treated my sisters, driving one to madness and the other to an untimely grave. But Zadwoski also had powerful friends amongst his compatriots, and so there were 2 strong parties formed. I have already spoken of the great array of legal talent that was gathered on both sides during my trial, but in spite of all that was done for me, the verdict was adverse, and I was sentenced to die. The verdict was received with great disfavor by my supporters, and, losing control of themselves, they came into collision with Zadwoski's partisans, and there was much fighting and bloodshed. When my poor old father heard of the verdict, he was seized with a fit of apoplexy, from which it was thought he could not rally. He did, however, subsequently recover, but he was a wreck physically and mentally. During the terrible year following my trial and the execution of my sentence, Dr. King never once relaxed his exertions. I had no fear of death myself. I had no clinging to life, but I did shrink from the ignominy and shame of a public execution. When at last it was found that all the appeals that had been made in my favor were rejected, and the law was to take its course, Dr. King visited me. He was burning with rage and indignation, and he told me that he would save my life yet, and he proposed a plan to that end. During subsequent interviews, he unfolded this plan to me, and by means of considerable bribes of money which my father found, for he was well off, Dr. King secured the cooperation of 2 of the warders, the sub-governor of the prison, and of Chowder Sam, the executioner, who would have sold his own mother for a few dollars. Without Chowder Sam's assistance, Dr. King's daring scheme could not have been carried out. In virtue of a solemn oath I took to Dr. King never to reveal the precise means he resorted to in order that I might be saved from the effect of the hangman's rope, I cannot disclose his plan. The object he aimed at was to prevent suffocation, and a singularly ingenious arrangement was adopted by the executioner acting under Dr. King's instructions, whereby too great pressure on the neck was prevented. I must mention that execution at this time in the United States was by sheer strangulation, not by a drop, and therefore Dr. King's plan was calculated to produce the desired effect. Had the drop been in force, the plan would have been useless. On the morning of my execution, the weather was in my favor, for it was snowing heavily, and though it did not prevent the people from assembling in enormous numbers, it did prevent them seeing the scaffold clearly, and Chowder Sam was enabled to do his part of the work without attracting attention. All being ready, I was strung up, and though the pressure of the rope was but slight, it was sufficient to produce insensibility. At first I suffered pain. Then there stole upon me a delightful sense of dreamy languor, and all that had been most joyous and beautiful in my life passed before me as in a vision. And then I saw my sister Mary, her dear face wearing a smile of ineffable sweetness, and her shoulders invested with great white pinions. After that came a blank, and what followed I subsequently learned from Dr. King. As soon as I was cut down, he claimed my body and had brought a shell secretly ventilated. Into this, my body was put, and then Dr. King had the coffin placed on a vehicle he had provided, and with all speed he conveyed my supposed corpse to his house. There he at once began means to bring about my resuscitation, and in the course of half an hour, his efforts were successful. For some time after recovering consciousness, I suffered much pain. I could not bear the light in my eyes, and I seemed so morbidly sensitive to sound that the slightest noise almost drove me mad. In the course of a few days, however, these symptoms wore off, and I gradually returned to my normal condition. Then I was secretly conveyed to Canada, where in a little while my father joined me, and I remained there until his death 4 years later, and after that I came to England, where I have resided ever since. I am a lonely old man now. My dear friend, Dr. King, and poor Nora have long been dead, and many another who made my wrecked life worth clinging to has likewise passed away, so that the world is to me now a blank. The end cannot be far off, and I am impatient for its coming. Death, whenever he comes, will come to me as a friend. It has been said that we make our own fate. He who reads this startling but true record can form his own opinion whether I made mine or it was thrust upon me. End of story. Recording by Mark LoSacco. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.